I'm the CEO of Mzwangetwa. Business solutions. I'm going to talk to you today about ways we can actually make SOEs perform better. The agenda is pretty short. I'm going to just go through what I believe to be high-level issues that need to be dealt with in the presentation, given the time limitations. I'll talk about the common SOE governance practices, which I'm sure most of them you are very familiar with. Different schools of thought on what the role of SOEs should be. But in this instance, I'll focus on just two of those schools of thought, because I believe you'll be able to resonate with the thinking behind them, and why SOEs are generally dysfunctional. And of course, it's just as important to talk about the consequences of dysfunctional SOEs on the business on one hand, and on the economy as a whole on the other. And then I will move on to talk about what I believe should be actions that are implemented across the board to make SOEs functional again, so that they are able to support the government programs and, more importantly, economic growth. In the last part of the presentation, we'll deal with questions, comments, your views on what I will have presented. Some of the most common governance practices entail the appointment process of board members, which is driven primarily from Lituli House by what is popularly known as the Deployment Committee. And the business background, qualifications and experience of those members of the Deployment Committee are actually quite questionable, and that actually increases the probability of inappropriate appointments. Political party membership and struggle credentials tend to be key considerations when it comes to appointments of board members, and of course some senior executives in SOEs. And whether the relevant ministry responsible for the set SOE gives inputs on who should be appointed, there is really no guarantee that those inputs will actually be accepted or be treated seriously. And the role of SOEs in the economy, the role is generally not clearly defined. There are many views on what SOEs should really do to make them effective and deliver, not just on business-related issues, but assist the government in delivering on its programs. So that's something that I will talk about briefly later in this presentation. And carrying on from there, there's also the issue that performance management is typically not really outcome-based. In other words, the contracting of the executives or even the board itself is not really outcome-based. It's not looking at the actual deliveries that they should present or should achieve. And the ministry and board generally are not aligned in terms of the direction the company must pursue. And if at all they are aligned, you may find that they are aligned for the wrong reasons. And the relevant minister typically sees nothing wrong with interfering in operational issues and often disregards the board's role, and this typically results in so-called turf wars between the board and ministry. And the board also tends to focus on operational issues, and that clearly is a recipe for poor performance, lapses in governance, and laxity in accountability. The different schools of thought that I mentioned or alluded to earlier that I want to look at, the first one being SOEs are actually expected to operate like privately owned organizations with board overseeing performance of the executive team or the organization. And the assumption is that there would be no political influence or interference, and the business would be driven by a profit motive. And the second school of thought postulates that SOEs are actually expected to create an enabling environment in the economy so that privately owned businesses in the main can thrive, and then also enhance the role of the developmental state, and then support the government in its initiatives to transform the economy, create employment, grow Black ownership and representativity in business, support initiatives to grow scarce and critical skills for the economy, etc., etc. These are the two schools that currently dominate the debate in both the private and the public space. And then the question to consider is, why are SOEs generally dysfunctional? I will actually just go on to list some of the key and very obvious things that we see around if we've had a lot of interaction with SOEs, but even people that haven't, through the mainstream press, read a lot about the things that are wrong in SOEs. The appointments of board members, which is actually something that's politically motivated in most cases. The minister responsible for relevant SOEs has got wide-ranging powers to overrule the board and EXCO, even when the decision is inconsistent with the company strategy. And then board members tend to toe the ministerial line to protect their jobs instead of doing what's best for the business or the country. Performance contracts are typically not aligned to the direction the business must pursue, partly because of lack of role clarity and partly because of self-serving interests of relevant ministers or politicians or even some board members. Competency levels of supply chain or procurement personnel are generally inadequate to deal with current realities and challenges. The legislative suite or environment governing procurement activities and processes tends to drive inefficiencies up, and this is an unintended consequence of overregulation. And this legislative suite governing procurement processes is undoubtedly inappropriate to support the state's transformation agenda, and most obviously also that falls short of driving value in the business. And the monetary value of tenders and the potential for self-enrichment tend to attract undue attention from politicians, the board, EXCOs of the relevant SOEs, and employees in certain categories within the SOE by virtue of their positions in the company. And some boards have actually created board tender committees to oversee and influence the award of tenders. And that took away the independence, objectivity, and fairness of the tender process. CEOs and other executives at times get instructions from politicians on the awarding of tenders. In some instances, the executives collude with relevant employees on the awarding of tenders for self-enrichment. Unfortunately, there's this growing trend amongst procurement officers in the SOE stable to collude with senior management and suppliers to influence the outcome of tenders, contravene legislative requirements and police with impunity, participate in the creation of companies that will be suppliers of specific products and services that are used widely in the business. And that offers the potential to enrich themselves because they know the amount of money spent on those products and services is quite high. They collude with middlemen as well to supply products that owners of intellectual property or manufacturers can supply cheaper. And poor management, and sometimes it's due to ignorance of procurement personnel, promotes the import of products that are locally available with dire consequences for the manufacturing industry and the economy. And then I think it's appropriate at this stage to just talk about the consequences of these inappropriate actions or actions that actually could be categorized as corrupt or inappropriate if you are running a business. The quality of services and products supplied by SOEs is actually compromised as a result of those inappropriate actions. And the consumer ends up paying a price that is not market related. And because the private sector is involved in many of these corrupt activities, it takes two, by the way, to tango. The consumers procuring from the said privately owned companies also end up paying a higher price for the said products and services. And SOEs, regrettably, are no longer attractive as employers of choice to well-qualified and experienced professionals because of poor governance, the poor financial status of SOEs, and lack of security. The dysfunctional nature of SOEs has impacted negatively on desirable and critical government programs that are actually aimed at uplifting historically disadvantaged individuals and targeted communities, whether it's in predominantly Black townships or in rural areas. Job creation and poverty alleviation are equally adversely impacted with disastrous socioeconomic consequences. Manufacturing, which should be at the forefront to drive sustainable economic growth, also becomes a casualty of the dysfunctionality in SOEs. All the above factors and many others, of course, contribute towards the creation of a failed state, lack of funding for affordable and quality education, continued inequality, runaway poverty, stubbornly high unemployment rate, and ultimately the lowering of the standard of living of all citizens in the country. Now it's actually appropriate to start talking about what I believe should be remedies or actions to turn around the current unacceptable state of state-owned companies. I believe that we need to seriously consider creating an independent body or structure, or use the current multi-party portfolio committees to define the role that SOEs must play and the minimum qualifying criteria of board members and other executives in state-owned companies. The pre-screening process must be rigorous to ensure that candidates who've been guilty of criminal offenses or they faced disciplinary actions in their previous jobs, found guilty and dismissed, that such candidates must actually be disqualified from being considered for positions in SOEs. And that obviously is something that should apply to the private sector. The committee to recommend to relevant cabinet subcommittee the final list of board appointments. Obviously, that must be based on the outcome of the interviews and the qualifying criteria that were defined, instead of just allowing the deployment committee to actually pick and choose who they believe should actually be on the boards of SOEs. Because very often we find that there are people that are actually unfit, they don't have the desired qualifications and attributes to actually be serving on the boards of SOEs. And the board must be independent, and any disputes that may arise between the board and the relevant minister must be referred to the set portfolio committee or the structure that will have been created to oversee SOEs. And the board must be the interface between the relevant ministry and the SOE. It's actually not professional, and it's also from a business point of view not a good practice to have any senior official or a minister in any department giving instructions to executives or operational staff in a business. The board must be the interface, and instructions to the senior executives must come from the board, particularly to instructions to the to the CEO of the relevant SOE. And the board must be fully empowered to appoint the group CEO and in some instances the CFO. And the appointment of the CFO must have the support of the relevant CEO, because the CFO typically reports to the CEO. So it makes sense for them to have synergy and be able to work together well. The board must also ensure that the performance contract of the group CEO is aligned with the role the SOE is mandated to play, and to actually approve the performance contract of the CEO. And the group CEO must actually be empowered to appoint the rest of the executive committee. We've seen instances of the ministry and sometimes also the board getting involved in the appointment of other executive committee members. And that is actually undermining the role of the group CEO, because the individuals concerned or whoever gets appointed will be reporting to the CEO. It's important that the CEO is actually happy or comfortable with the said executive committee members. The chief procurement officer must report directly to the group CEO. The relegation of the CPO position to report to one of the EXCO members has resulted in the role of the position being undermined and manipulated at the expense of the company. And the implications are actually quite wide, in the sense that there are ripple effects to the rest of the economy because of some of the decisions that are taken by the CPO that has got no authority. The accountability for fair adjudication and award of tenders must fall squarely on the CPO and ultimately, of course, the group CEO to whom the CPO would be reporting. And board adjudication committees must be abolished across the board. We've seen the havoc that they've wreaked when it comes to tenders, especially high value tenders in the SOE. The award of tenders above a defined threshold must be audited by an independent party, which could be the internal audit function, and the award confirmed once the audit outcome demonstrates that the process was objective, fair, transparent, and in the interest of the business. The current procurement legislation must definitely be reviewed to ensure high levels of efficiency, improved governance, and they must be able to support the national transformation program of the government. The good news there is that the most important piece of legislation that regulates procurement, namely the PPPFA, is under review. The first draft has actually been issued for public comment, and hopefully in the not too distant future, we will have the procurement bill promulgated, and hopefully most of the current challenges in the procurement space will be addressed by that. Obviously, that also presupposes that the right people will be appointed to drive supply chain or procurement. And skills levels of procurement personnel must definitely receive special attention. And what is also necessary going forward is to have procurement officers registered, just like in the accounting profession and the engineering profession. That must actually be implemented in supply chain or in procurement, so that whoever is involved in the procurement or handling of tenders will actually have a license, and there will be a national code of conduct that that individual must actually adhere to. And if they misbehave or do things that are contrary to the code of conduct or practice, then the relevant body will be empowered to take the necessary disciplinary action and even go so far as to remove them from the register of people that are authorized to practice as procurement officers. But that is actually envisaged in the draft procurement bill that will hopefully be promulgated soon. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for allowing me to share my views with you. And the next phase will, as I pointed out earlier, entail uh, getting your questions, your views, and I will do the best I can to answer them as honestly and as frankly as I possibly can. Thank you.